I'm Walter Taylor. I've been the pastor at the Presbyterian Church over on Oak Island for just over 10 years. And the presentation tonight was one that I gave, Pastor Neil mentioned, back several months ago for the Brunswick Baptist Association. I'm a friend of Jeff Gibby, and he'd asked me to come over. And over the years, I have collected lots of books, and I have a little collection here of facsimiles of old books, which means a facsimile is a completely new reprint. I don't sink my money into books that are actually 500 years old because I would be too afraid to pick them up and to handle them, much less to bring them out and show you all. And so I have invested over the years when I could get a really good deal on facsimiles, which are reprints which attempt to be as realistic as they can to the original in the modern time. So these books tonight, some of them I'll pass around, and others you can come up and look at before the night is out. But what I wanted to talk about tonight was the history of the Bible in English. There's a whole other history of the Bible and where it came from, but tonight I'm concentrating on the ones that we hold in our hand and the origin of the Bible coming to us in the English language. And this is kind of prompted, and my speaking at the association was prompted by the fact that this year is the 500th anniversary of what? Anybody know? Protestant Reformation. And so we've been making a big celebration out of that this year over at Oak Island EPC, and so you see this as a part of that whole project. But before we get started tonight, I'm going to ask a question that I'll answer as we get into our program a little bit. And if I were to ask you the question, what single individual had the biggest imprint and influence on the English language, who would you probably say? Any ideas? Now, I'll tell you what I think a little bit later, but who's that guy y'all had to study in high school? And Shakespeare. And that's usually the first answer everybody gives is William Shakespeare. And Shakespeare did have a huge impact on the language, and lots of expressions that we use come straight from Shakespeare. The milk of human kindness, and it's all Greek to me, and a lot of these expressions that first occurred in the plays of Shakespeare. And that's what most people say. They'll say William Shakespeare I'm going to say somebody else a little bit later, and we're not to him yet. But the Bible was written originally, the New Testament in Greek, and the Old Testament in Hebrew, with portions of it in Aramaic, mainly in the book of Daniel. But in the time of the ancient church, the Bible was translated by a man named Jerome into Latin. And the Latin translation of the Bible became the official Bible for basically all Christians in the western part of Europe. Now, in the eastern part of Europe, it was still in Greek. That was a whole other history and a whole other experience. But in Europe, as we know it, the Bible was in Latin. And that had to do with the fact that the Bible was translated into Latin because it was the dominant language of the world because of the Roman Empire. And so the church services were in Latin, the Bible was in Latin, and it sort of crystallized there. And so as time went on, fewer and fewer people spoke Latin because Latin morphed and evolved into all sorts of different languages, French, Italian, all these different languages that came out of Latin, the Romance language, and they're called Romance because of the connection to Roman. Latin was the Roman language, and then the Romance languages are those languages that grew out of it. Just like the English we speak is different from the English that was spoken 600 years ago. And if you look at a book 600 years old, you can see, as you begin to read it, the language has shifted and changed. But as it often is with holy languages, which Latin had sort of become that over time, the service of the church didn't change. The singing in the church, which was pretty much limited to the monks, continued to be in Latin. The Bible continued to be in Latin, and it wasn't accessible to the language of the people. Also, there had grown up in the medieval church a worry that the Bible was too complicated to be in the hands of the people. It can create a lot of problems to put the Bible in the hands of the people in their own languages. And so it's just as well if they need to know something about it, they can get an education and read it in Latin, or they can go and ask the priest. And if your priest isn't illiterate, which often was the case by the later Middle Ages, then you could maybe talk to your priest and find out. But for most people, the only Bible they encountered was in the worship of the church and the Mass, and that was all in Latin anyway. And so in the later Middle Ages, things began to loosen up a little bit depending on what country you were in. Because we like to think of the Roman Catholic Church as Protestants as this huge monolith where everything is the same everywhere. And to a degree that's true, but the fact was that the Roman Catholic Church in different countries of Europe had a little bit of leeway on this whole matter of whether they would allow the Bible to be in the language of the people or not. And so as time began, and as we got to the later part of the Middle Ages, in some parts of Europe, they were beginning to let portions of the Bible be translated into the languages of the people, French and Dutch and Spanish and whatever. But the last country to allow that was England. Oddly enough, the Roman Catholic Church in England was one of the most conservative of all of Europe, and it was the last major country to allow the Bible to be translated. People were getting tired of waiting, so in the 14th century, a guy named John Wycliffe, who was a priest and a professor at Oxford University, translated the New Testament into English. And for the first time, the whole New Testament was translated into English. Now, there was sort of something you need to realize about that translation. Wycliffe was not a Greek scholar, but he was a Latin scholar. So the Bible he translated was the Latin New Testament that they had, which of course was a translation 1,000 years before of the Greek New Testament. So you can see that the Bible that they got from John Wycliffe was not directly from the Greek for the New Testament, but it was from Latin, and for the first time, people, if they could read, could begin to read the Bible in English. There was a problem with it. It was ruled to be illegal. And so the Wycliffe New Testament, which was being copied, because at this point Gutenberg hadn't made the printing press yet, so everything was hand copied, which also tended to make books very expensive. Everything was hand copied, but copies of Wycliffe's Bible was getting out. Wycliffe was teaching at Oxford. He was starting to question certain practices in the Roman Catholic Church, the doctrine of transubstantiation and the authority of the Pope and the role of the priest and all these sorts of things. He was beginning to challenge and to question, but fortunately for Wycliffe, the local baron, the local ruler, was a friend of his, and he protected him. And so Wycliffe did not face the death of a heretic that many of the people who were walking around reading his Bible to the masses and preaching to them did face. But the Wycliffe Bible, which comes to us, from the latter part of the life of John Wycliffe, was in a form of English that was translated directly from the Latin. So to read it, you're reading Middle English. You remember, did you ever have to read Chaucer in high school in the old form of English? Okay, this is what reading Wycliffe is like, because it's the same general period of time. And I'll pass this around. Again, this is a facsimile, and it is in English. It's in that older form of English, Middle English. And if you look at this over time, and you begin, because the way that the letters are written has changed, you can begin to actually read this. But you have to, it's one of these things, you have to let your eyes adjust to the letters to do that. This is a printed copy, of course, because this is not a handwritten, but the original that this is a copy of it would have been a handwritten edition of the New Testament. So that's what the first New Testament in English would have looked like. And again, it's Gothic lettering, so the lettering is different from the way we write it in modern. But now John Wycliffe had a huge influence because students were flocking to him from all over Europe. And there was a man from what we know now as the Czech Republic, from Prague, whose name was Jerome, who was a student of John Wycliffe. He came up from Czech Republic to what is now the Czech Republic, central part of Europe, studied with him, went back, and began teaching Wycliffe's ideas to his students. And one of his students was named John Huss. And if you know anything about church history, John Huss is sort of considered the 100-year precursor of Luther. And John Huss was burned at the stake for challenging certain teachings of the Roman Catholic Church a couple of generations after Wycliffe. Wycliffe died. He died of natural causes. He was not hunted down and burned at the stake, which was the favorite way of dealing with heretics. However, when the political scene changed and the local baron didn't have the authority that he once did, the church and the English king finally caught up with Wycliffe after his death, and his bones were dug up and put on trial and found guilty of heresy and burned into powder and thrown into the local river, the local stream, which filtered out into one of the rivers, which eventually went, of course, into the Atlantic Ocean. And the story goes that, kind of symbolically speaking, the ashes of Wycliffe, went to all the world because it was a sign things were beginning to change. For the next 100 years or so or more, these followers of Wycliffe are running around with New Testaments like you've seen. They also began to do the same thing with the Old Testament, again from Latin. And they were called Lollards, the Lollards. And we don't know exactly why they were called that, but that was the nickname they were stuck with, and they began to be hunted down and persecuted. But they started having influence throughout England anyway, and they were challenging the doctrine of transubstantiation, that the bread and the wine at the Lord's Supper becomes the physical body and blood of Christ. They rejected that. They rejected the power and wealth of the church. They began to challenge the role of priests and began challenging a number of things related to all of this. And so the ideas were starting to get out through England. And to have one of these Bibles was enough to get you tried and convicted of heresy and executed for the next 230, 40 years in England. So there's a lot of blood involved in getting the Bible in English. If you want to hit the next slide all this is going on. 1500s roll around. And of course, 1517, Martin Luther comes along, Protestant Reformation. And so things are starting to germinate in continental Europe, in the German lands and the French lands and Spanish lands and other places. People are translating the Bible into the languages of the people. And they're not doing it from the Latin. They're beginning now to do it from the original Greek and Hebrew. And one of the most significant examples of that was the Bible that was translated by Martin Luther in German. If you remember, Luther made his initial statement in 1517. A few years later, he was put on trial before the Emperor of Germany. He had another prince protecting him, or he would have been executed. But he went before the Emperor of Germany, the German Empire, the old Holy Roman Empire. In 1521, he made his famous defense where they asked him to recant of all the writings he had done, and his famous, unless you can convince me by Scripture or reason, I cannot and will not recant. Here I stand, I can do no other. My mind is captive to the Word of God. The emperor, in order to get Luther at this meeting, had promised him safe passage and about 48 hours afterwards. And after that, you're on your own, buddy. So Luther leaves the city. Things are in an uproar after what he has said. He's on his way back to the city of Wittenberg, where he lives, when he is abducted and kidnapped. And what he didn't know most immediately, and what his supporters didn't know, was his own local prince was kidnapping him for his own safety. And so Luther is kidnapped, and the prince, Prince Frederick, who got the name Frederick the Wise, and for the way that he handled so many things, Frederick told his men, "You kidnap him and you take him to one of my castles. I don't want to know which one." So if I'm asked where Luther is, I can say, "I don't know where Luther is." And that's what happened. And so for the better part of a year, Luther was in seclusion, was in hiding. He took on a false identity, and in his spare time, well, in all of his time, he began translating the Bible from Greek, the New Testament, into German. And this is a facsimile. This was a big one. I won't pass it around, but you'll be invited to come up and look at this at the end of our program. But if you look at this, it's in German. You will notice that it's in chapter divisions, but there are not yet verses. The Bible was not divided up into chapters until the end of the Middle Ages, beginning of the Renaissance. And so around the time of Luther and such. And it didn't get into verses until a couple of decades later. So this was kind of how it looked. The Bible with chapters. This is the second chapter of Matthew. You see the Roman letter numerals there, but you'll look and there's no verse numberings. And this began to have a lot of impact, and people in England began wanting to translate the Bible into English. And things were in foment in England because you had this king on the throne who wanted to divorce his wife, but the problem was she was the daughter of the king of Spain, and he wanted to divorce her because she couldn't give him an heir. And a king needs to have an heir. Otherwise, your rule is insecure. You don't know who's going to be on the throne next. Wars break out when that happens. And so he is trying to get the Pope to agree to give him a divorce so that he can marry, hopefully, another woman who can give him an heir. Anybody know who that was? Henry VIII. So Henry VIII finally gets tired of waiting. He breaks with the Roman Catholic Church. He proclaims himself the head of the church in England, and the English church then separates itself from Rome. The interesting thing was, Henry was not ever a full-blown Protestant. He just wanted to be an English Catholic in which he was the head of the church. And so a lot of people think, Henry, the first Protestant king, he really wasn't. A lot of the Protestants began taking advantage of this situation, and his court began to get filled with them. And one of the most significant ones at the time was Anne Boleyn, who was wife number 2. But he was still not a fan of Luther. In fact, Henry had written a tract against Luther when Luther first came out in favor of reforming the church. And the Pope awarded Henry a title of Defender of the Faith for writing this tract against Luther, because Henry actually did have somewhat of a theological education. And so Henry was not really sympathetic to the Reformation, but he was enough of an opportunist that he was willing to use whatever he needed to use for his political betterment. Young priest named William Tyndale studied at Oxford and at Cambridge, and somewhere along the way in his studies, he was exposed to the thinking of Luther and the Reformation. And so William Tyndale, through the Bishop of London, approached the English church and through the bishop, the king, asking permission to begin translating the Bible into English. And the answer was no. It was not only no, it was absolutely not. So, William Tyndale eventually crosses the English Channel into continental Europe, and there he sets to work to translate the Bible into English from the original languages, because he was a scholar par excellence. He was a master of several languages. In fact, he knew other European languages, so he would study as he was, working. Now, you have to realize the only Bible in English before Tyndale is Wycliffe, and that one's how old now? That, is 200 years old now. The language has changed radically. It was still not ingrained in the hearts and minds of the people because there weren't a lot of them out there. So Tyndale is essentially translating the Bible into English for the first time. And you think about that because a lot of biblical expressions that we know were actually framed into English by Tyndale. I mean, he read it in the Greek, but there's more than one way to translate a phrase, right? And so a lot of what we know as biblical English, as the traditional biblical renderings, were all put into the English language by William Tyndale. William Tyndale had more influence on the English language than any other person ever has. And one of the reasons why is because from William Tyndale's Bible, something like between 80 and 90% of his formulations survive by the time in the King James Bible. The King James Bible is 80 to 90% the work of William Tyndale. And so he is the one who shaped the direction that modern English would take because of the role that the Bible has had in the shaping of the English language. Tyndale goes off to Europe. He's kind of on the run. He starts out in Germany. He translates the New Testament into English, and the first edition of it is 1526. And again, this is a facsimile of what the original looked like. Again, it's in the old script. This was actually printed because the printing press had come out. He purposefully made it so that they would be small, and the originals were actually a bit smaller than this. You open it up and you can see what the page sizes really were. And part of that was it was made small so that they could be smuggled back into England. And so the first edition comes out in 1526, and he sends it back, and it's like wildfire. Anne Boleyn has a copy of William Tyndale's New Testament with her in King Henry's palace that she read for her own personal devotions. That's how significant the Tyndale New Testament was. Tyndale did several revisions of that New Testament because, the Bible is a translation, so you're always, for whatever reason, deciding to make, corrections and changes in the translation because a translation is still a translation. And future editions would come out, and Henry began playing this kind of game of cat and mouse with the authorities back in England. They were after him because they didn't want this thing getting out. Henry was after him. Henry's lead advisor, Thomas More. You ever heard of Thomas More, a man for all seasons? And we praise Thomas More. Thomas More was, from a Protestant perspective, not a very nice man. Thomas More vigorously persecuted Protestants. He would have them whipped in his own gardens for his own entertainment. He would appear and enjoy their executions. He utterly despised William Tyndale. And there's a collection of writings between Tyndale and More against each other. Now, Tyndale, of course, is running around in continental Europe, so it's hard for the English crown to get him. The Bishop of London was another enemy of Tyndale, the same one who told him he couldn't translate the Bible into English. And at one point, a new edition of the New Testament came out, and the Bishop of London thought he was being crafty because he made connections in continental Europe to buy the entire printing of that edition. He sent the money, he got the printing, he burned them all, not knowing that he was dealing with agents in cahoots with William Tyndale, who took all of that money back, gave it to Tyndale, and he put it into the production of his next edition. So Tyndale was actually able to fund his work by, I guess that's the earliest GoFundMe, right? You know, how to get your enemies to fund you. But a very, very, again, this one has chapters. It does not have verses, but you can pass that around. That is what the first New Testament in English looked like. And again, if you study that enough and you get your eyes adjusted to the way the letters are formed, you can actually read this. Now, if one of the things you can do before you leave, if you're interested, this is it's a later edition. That's the 26th. This is the 34 edition of his New Testament in modern English print with the original words. And you can take a look at this. And one of the things, I'll start it over here, one of the things that's so striking about it is you'll see how much, anybody have a chance to see the Wycliffe Bible? You can see how close it is to the language of King James. Tyndale has to be on the run because one of the things that kept him from being captured were international politics. And so he winds up in the city of Antwerp, in what is Belgium now. It's a city that's dear to my heart because I spent 3.5 years there pastoring an English-speaking church in Antwerp, and so I have gone to the street where they think Tyndale was eventually captured. But he was in Antwerp, and he went to Antwerp. He was working continued to work on the New Testament, began to translate the Old Testament. And he went to Antwerp because Antwerp was a great city to do this because, number one, it was a printing city. The finest printing presses in Europe were in what is now Belgium and Holland, and Antwerp was a printing city. And so there were printers there he could work with in getting it out. There was also a huge international cloth merchant business going on in Antwerp. And there was lots of commerce going on between Antwerp and England. And he was in cahoots with a lot of the cloth merchants. And so that's how they were smuggling the New Testaments, small New Testaments. They could smuggle them into shipments of cloth. And that's how they were getting them over the channel to England. It's not that far to go across the channel there. And so he was working in Antwerp. At the meantime, Thomas More and Henry VIII and some of the church officials were still on his heels. There was a man, an Englishman, who pretended to be a friend of William Tyndale, who set him up. And one day he had made arrangements to meet Tyndale for dinner. Tyndale thought it was somebody he could trust. Tyndale left his lodgings. He was apprehended by some armed men. However, they didn't do anything with him in Antwerp. They took him closer to Brussels. Have any of you ever been to Belgium? Anybody ever flown? If you ever fly to Brussels, the airport is near the place where he was imprisoned. Because, see, Antwerp was an international commercial town. They were officially Catholic there, but hunting heretics and burning them at the stake is not good for international business. And so the people in Antwerp just kind of kept a blind eye to what Tyndale was doing. So they capture him, they take him down to another one of the cities south, closer to Brussels. He's put in a castle there. He's held captive in a prison dungeon in the castle, is eventually put on trial and found guilty of heresy and is executed. Now, before his execution, he was in prison for a number of months. The wheels of justice are never quick or the wheels of injustice, as it may be. And so the last letter that William Tyndale wrote has survived. And I'll read it to you. It was a request that he had written to his jailers at the prison. And I'll just read it to you. He wrote it to the local governor there in the city of Vilvoorde, where he was captured. I believe, right worshipful, the title he's calling the master that he's writing, that you are not unaware of what may have been determined concerning me. Wherefore I beg your lordship, and that by the Lord Jesus, that if I am to remain here through the winter, you will request the commissary to have the kindness to send me from the goods of mine which he has, all his personal belongings that were abducted with him, a warmer cap, for I suffer greatly from cold in the head and am afflicted by a perpetual catarrh. You may know what a catarrh is. It's an old word, and it means an effusive amount of mucus flowing out of your head. So he's sick. He's just constantly sick because he's in these cold, damp quarters, and it rains a lot in Belgium. I can attest to that, okay? So it's a cold, damp, wet place. So he wants his cap to keep warm. For I suffer greatly from cold in the head and am afflicted by a perpetual catarrh, which is much increased in this cell. A warmer coat also, for this which I have is very thin, a piece of cloth too to patch my leggings. My overcoat is worn out, my shirts are also worn out. He, the man at the commissary, has a woolen shirt, if he will be good enough to send it. I have also with him leggings of thicker cloth to put on above. He also has warmer nightcaps. And I ask to be allowed to have a lamp in the evening. It is indeed wearisome sitting alone in the dark. You can imagine the kind of life that he's facing now in prison for what he's been doing. But most of all, and this is, I think, the most moving part of this letter, listen to this, but most of all, I beg and beseech your clemency to be urgent with the commissary that he will kindly permit me to have the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew grammar, and Hebrew dictionary, that I may pass the time in that study. In return, may you obtain what you most desire, so only that it be for the salvation of your soul, but if any other decision has been taken concerning me to be carried out before winter, I will be patient, abiding the will of God, to the glory of the grace of my Lord Jesus Christ, whose Spirit, I pray, may ever direct your heart. So what's he want most of all? He wants to continue his translating work because he was working on the Old Testament now. And he got a good chunk of the Old Testament done before he was arrested. You can hit there you go. That's a copy of the letter it's in Latin, but the letter I just read to you in translation. All right. You can put it to the next one. On October of 1536, so you have something else you can mark an anniversary of this month, in addition to Luther's nailing of the 95 Theses on October 31st of 1517. So, a couple of decades later, William Tyndale was brought out of his cell. He was found guilty. His robes as a priest were stripped off of him because he was a priest in the church. And he was lucky because in many places in continental Europe, a heretic would not be burned to death. They would strangle you first. And so William Tyndale, his final words were, "Lord God, open the eyes of the King of England." He was strangled to death, and then his body was burned, and burned to ashes, which was the way you dealt with heretics in the 15th century, 16th century. However, the impact of Tyndale lived because his work was out there. It was being utilized. He had his followers who were continuing in the work. And so there were several folks who continued the work of finishing the Bible that he had. The New Testament was complete. The Old Testament wasn't yet complete. You can hit the next slide. And so William Tyndale, the year was the date of his execution, 1536. While he was basically indisposed in prison, some of his followers and other people committed to the Reformation took his work and began to complete it. And so in 1535, the first complete translation of the Bible in English was finished by Miles Coverdale. Now, Coverdale was not a scholar of Greek or Hebrew. He took the work of Tyndale, his New Testament and his Old Testament, and he finished it using the Latin Bible and Luther's translation. So Coverdale takes the books that hadn't been translated yet, and because he can study German, between looking at the Latin and looking at what Luther has done in German, he puts it into English. 1535. And then in 1537, John Rogers publishes a full translation of the Bible. So it's the first full English Bible translated from the original languages. And but it was still a dangerous thing to do, and so he did not do it under his own name. The Bible done by John Rogers we know as the Thomas Matthew Bible, because Thomas Matthew was the name he came up with under which to publish it. So it wouldn't be published under his name, because he saw what they did to his friend William Tyndale a year before. He didn't really want to have to go through that himself. So the Matthew's Bible comes out in 1537, first complete Bible. When Thomas Matthew had it printed, he took a few pages where he had just a little bit of kind of odd art thrown in here and there. And there are 3 or 4 pages where he has, and let me find another example of it, the initials of significant people make it, and at the end of the Old Testament, and again, this is in old script, but it's easier to read than the Tyndale is. You have these initials here, stylized letters, WT. No explanation as to why they're there. But at the end of the Old Testament, it's WT. They're not for Walter Taylor, though, this was his monument to William Tyndale that he put into the text. So the Thomas Matthew Bible comes out in 1537, and begins to be popular and is widely read. And then finally in 1539, so we're looking now at 3 years since Tyndale's been executed. 1539, Henry VIII gives royal approval to the Bible in English, and it's called the Great Bible. And you know why they called it the Great Bible? Because it was big. Great in older English often just simply meant big. And it was published, this is not the Great Bible here, but it was kind of published in this size. So it could be put into churches and used as a pulpit Bible. So they referred to it as the Great Bible. So the Great Bible is produced. It has the sanction of King Henry VIII in fulfillment of William Tyndale's prayer 3 years before. Lord God, open the eyes of the King of England. I don't know that his eyes were ever really opened, but by this time he was willing. Henry went slowly in step with the Reformation. And and some of the same people were involved in the production, the final edition of the Great Bible. Utilizes Thomas Matthew Bible, and it utilizes William Tyndale. So 1539, it comes out. All right, you can hit the next one. Now, a number of things happen, and it's easy to get lost in all the politics, but the Protestant Reformation was tied to politics. Henry VIII dies. He has, how many wives does he have? Anybody remember? Not 8, close. 6. 6 wives. The 6 wives of Henry VIII. Divorced, beheaded, she died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And that's how you can remember the fate of the 6 wives of Henry. Wife number 6 outlived him. The others either divorced, 2 were divorced, 2 were beheaded, 1 died of natural causes after childbirth, and the last one outlives him. Henry dies. His son, whose mother was the one who died, wife number 3, she died after childbirth, giving birth to his son Edward VI. Edward was raised, now Henry had other children. He had Mary, he had Elizabeth, but they were daughters. So it passes over them and goes to the son. Edward had been trained and tutored in the royal court by ardent Protestants. And he was, by all counts, a fine young man. He was still a boy when he became king, so someone else had to oversee the nation for him, a regent. But in the day of Edward VI, the church began a serious attempt to reform the Church of England. And this is when the Book of Common Prayer came out in a couple of editions, and England goes whole hog with the Reformation. Edward was an interesting boy. He was a sickly boy, but he enjoyed hearing sermons. He enjoyed hearing the Bible preached, and he enjoyed long ones. So somebody had trained him right? He liked to hear the preacher preach on lengthy sermons. He enjoyed that, so that shows he was a good guy, right? Come on, right? Yeah, Edward dies. He still dies a young man. He was in poor health. He dies. Things are topsy-turvy for a short period of time when they finally settle on the fact that his older sister, Mary, is going to be queen now. You might remember Mary Tudor. She was so famous, a drink got named after her. Anybody know what the drink was? I know I'm in a Baptist church, but you've got to tie this in. A Bloody Mary. That was her nickname, Bloody Mary. Mary was the daughter of Henry's first wife, Catherine, who was an arch Spanish Catholic, very conservative Catholic. And Mary has languished under the Protestantization of England as a devout Roman Catholic. So she becomes queen, and she turns the whole thing around. And England goes back to Rome. Persecution breaks out among the Protestants. Over 300 or so are executed during her reign. And her sister Elizabeth gets to live only because she's in the royal court and she doesn't force any matters. She's kind of, living at the pleasure of her sister Mary. And Mary comes to the throne and throws everything back the way it was, with the result that some of the leading Protestant minds in England leave the country and become exiles across the Channel in Europe. And they settle in several places, but probably the most significant group of exiles settle in the city of Geneva, in what is now Switzerland. Why do they go to Geneva? What's going on in Geneva? Anybody know what's going on in Geneva? The Reformation has taken hold in Geneva. Geneva is one of the most significant places for the Reformation. There's scholars there, printing presses galore there. They're producing pastors that are going all over Europe, carrying the Reformation with them. They're doing all this openly. There's safety in Geneva. Geneva is the city of who? Whom? John Calvin. So the Calvinist Reformation is centered in Geneva. So a collection of these scholars and an English congregation is established, an English-speaking congregation is established in Geneva. And some of the greatest scholars from England are there. And in fact, one of the pastors of that congregation is actually a Scotsman whose name is John Knox, in case you know that name, who would come back later and bring the Reformation to Scotland. The scholars in Geneva say, you know, we need to produce a revision of the Bible. And so they set to work, a group of translators, and in 1557 they produced the first edition of their New Testament. And again, this is a facsimile of it. And so in 1557, a translation, and it's still a revision. I mean, it's a revision of what they've had, and it's a revision, of course, all revisions go back where? They go back to William Tyndale. William Tyndale. And so in 1557, the first edition of what was called would be called the Geneva Bible, because it was translated into English in Geneva, is produced. And this is a facsimile of what that Bible looks like. Now, tell me if you can read that one. The first English Bible printed in the same Latin script that we use today. And so you will look at this, and you'll look at the Geneva Bible, and you'll say, hey, I can read this. Why is there a V instead of a U? Okay, you can actually, because the U's and the V's have switched places in English since then. And 1557, the New Testament comes out. 1560, the whole Bible comes out. But when the whole Bible comes out, it is not just a translation. It is a study Bible. So in 1560, the first study Bible comes out in the English language. And it's the Geneva Bible. And several people were involved in it, including this guy Miles Coverdale, who was the guy that put out the first Bible several years before, but he's happy now because he's in Geneva, these biblical scholars that can read the original languages and do the revision. John Knox, and then William Whittingham was another guy involved in it, and all of these would be very important leaders in the English church later on. It was the first English Bible to use verse divisions. It was the first study Bible. It was the first Bible that would come to America, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And even after the King James Version of the Bible was translated 51 years later, many people continued to use the Geneva Bible, even though the King James was out there. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And in many respects, the Geneva Bible was a more modern translation than that Bible that would come along 51 years later. And you can even sometimes look at that when you compare the two and see that. That is what the title page of the Geneva Bible looks like. And when I say it's, and you can come up and look at this one a little bit later, but if you look at this, what you're going to see in the Geneva Bible is, on the one hand, you'll see the text in 2 columns. And see all these little bitty print and little margins here? Those were study notes. And as other editions came out, notes got added to it. Like any, put out a study Bible later and somebody adds even more study notes. But if you look through, you'll see that there are significant study notes. There are chapter summaries before the chapter, and there are introductions to each of the books in the form of study notes. So all of this comes out with the Geneva Bible, and the Geneva Bible becomes the primary Bible for the Protestant Reformation in the English-speaking world at the time, England and Scotland. So the Geneva Bible comes out. It comes out in numerous editions. If you look at the thing up here, this is from the book of Genesis. So here you have your biblical text. These are the study notes. There's little symbols in the verses, just like study Bibles today. And then this is the introduction to the book up there. And so this thing goes out like, it sets the English-speaking world on fire. And but shortly after it's printed, Mary dies. Mary dies. Her sister becomes queen, Queen Elizabeth, a Protestant, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry and the first one to get done in by him. And so Elizabeth becomes queen, and about the time the Geneva Bible is in its final printing, in its first printing, but finally being printed, and so it gets dedicated to her. And so Geneva Bible, most of the Bibles were a little bit smaller than this one. This one has been increased in size just a little bit. But your standard Geneva Bible is a little bit smaller than this, but not by much. But they also came out with even smaller editions of it. This is a 1591 replica edition. And you'll be amazed anybody could read it in those days. But this is what it looked like without the study notes, so that it could be in this size. And you can come up and take a look at this one afterwards. You'll look at that and say, how can anybody read that? Probably with a magnifying glass. Okay? But it's still amazing that they had the technology to print so small. Geneva Bible is, from the standpoint of scholarship, an excellent translation. Has all these wonderful study notes in it. It was not... It wasn't well liked by all of the authorities in the English church, though, because the study notes in it reflected a Reformed or Calvinist theology. Some of the bishops in the Church of England don't like the Geneva Bible because they don't like these study notes that are in it. It reflects a form of Protestantism that was coming out of Geneva rather than the form of Protestantism that Queen Elizabeth was going to settle for in the end, which was sort of this kind of halfway, what we know as the Anglican tradition, Episcopal tradition. So in 1576, the bishops of Elizabeth put out a translation called the Bishop's Bible, and it was dreadful. It was a dreadful translation, and everybody knew it. So people didn't want to use it. They continued to use the Geneva Bible, which was still being printed at the time. 1582, the English-speaking Roman Catholics who've left England and have gone to France put out a translation, the Douay-Rheims Bible. Old Testament wasn't finished till 1609, but the New Testament in 1582. It was translated, of course, from the Latin, because it was a Roman Catholic translation. That was the official Catholic translation in English until like the 1950s. And it was a dreadful translation as well. But the Geneva takes all of these down. Even though these translations come out later, they can't compete. So what happens? Well, Elizabeth dies, and they don't know who the king is going to be. She's on her deathbed, and they finally come to her because she never married, she never had children. They come to her and say, Your Majesty, who's going to be the next monarch? Because they don't have an heir. And she tells them on her deathbed her cousin James. She has a distant cousin who's the king of Scotland, because at this time it was before the thrones of England and Scotland merged. They merged with James. James the Sixth of Scotland, who is known as James the First when he comes to England, because England's never had a king named James. So he becomes James the First down there. But in Scotland, he's the sixth one to have that name. James has been raised a Presbyterian. He's a Scot. And he had kind of a running struggle with the Church of Scotland during his reign as king because he was a Protestant. He was committed to the Reformation, but he really liked the way the English did it, with the king being the head of the church. And the Scottish Presbyterians, from the very beginning of the Reformation, said, the only king and head of the church is Jesus Christ. You are a member of the church, but you are not the king of the church. The king is Christ alone. So he had this kind of little tug of war going on with the Scottish Presbyterians. It reached its height. One time he went off to the General Assembly. You know, we Presbyterians like to have our annual General Assembly where our national meeting. He went off to the national meeting and he was trying to impose his will on the government of the church. And the moderator of the General Assembly, every year Presbyterians elect a new moderator of the General Assembly. The story goes the moderator, Melville, of the General Assembly took the king by the sleeve of his robe, which was just considered just a no-no. And he informed him, Your Majesty, there are two kingdoms in this land, one over which you are king, and the other of which you are but a member. Yeah. So, in the meantime, while Elizabeth is queen, the Reformation is kind of a tug of war of its own, because you've got the conservative side of it that wants to maintain a lot of the traditions of the Catholic Church without the theology, but having the bishops and all of these, the liturgy and such. And then you have this group on the other side known as Puritans, okay? And they're the Presbyterians and really the Congregationalists. Baptists are descended from the Puritans, okay? And they're wanting the church to be reformed more like it is in Geneva and up in Scotland. So they're kind of at battle with each other. The establishment of the church, the bishops, want to maintain rule by bishops, and the Puritans and the Presbyterians want to do away with the bishops and have the church governed by elders and meet in councils and assemblies to govern the church. So you've got this struggle going on. Word gets out that the King of Scotland is now going to be the King of England. And there is jubilation on the part of the Puritans and the Presbyterians in England because one of our own is coming to the throne, and he will bring with him the Scottish Reformation and will look like our brothers in Scotland when we go to church. The bishops are worried because what is he going to do to us now? So James comes down south. Before he ever gets to London, things are so tense. The Puritans have written a petition with 1,000 signatories on it, calling for changes in the liturgy, changes in the book of Common Prayer, for a new revision of the Bible, for all sorts of things they want the king to do because they're really convinced that having been trained by the Presbyterians, he was going to be one of them. The bishops are ready to try to fight to maintain the order in the system that they have. So they have a conference at one of the palaces that belongs to the royal house before he gets into London. The Puritans misjudged everything because as soon as James crossed the Tweed River, the boundary between the two countries, he became a high church Anglican. And why would he? He wanted to be head of the church. The Scots wouldn't let him, but by golly, he's in England now. James didn't like the Geneva Bible. It had not because of the translation, he didn't like the notes in it, because some of the notes in the Geneva Bible offended him. For example, do you remember the story of the midwives when Moses was a child and Pharaoh sent the order that all of the Hebrew boys were to be killed upon birth, and the Hebrew midwives lie to Pharaoh. They come up with all the reasons that they can't You don't know these Hebrew women. They pop the babies out fast. By the time we get there, they're done, and they've whisked them away. And we don't ever see the boy babies. They're gone before we get there. Well, it was a lie because they were in cahoots with the Hebrews. And there's this interesting note in Exodus 1:19 in which it says this. Their disobedience, that is to Pharaoh, herein was lawful, but their dissembling evil. Okay, they said, okay, it was still a sin to tell a lie, but it wasn't a sin to disobey the king in this command. James didn't buy that. He believed in the divine right of kings. And so there were some other places as well that he didn't like the notes, especially when it came to kings in the Old Testament, because you had some pretty wicked kings, if you remember your history of ancient Israel and Judah. So he's not happy with the study notes in the Geneva Bible anyway. Well, he gets to the Hampton Court Palace, and the representatives of the Puritans are there, a few of them. All these English bishops are there. The Puritans present their petition to the king with all these things they want him to change. The bishops are there sweating it out, praying, "Oh Lord, let this man not be a Presbyterian." And the king hears all of this, and he finally speaks. And he rises up, and he addresses the Puritans, and he says to them, "The coming together of a Scottish presbytery and a king make about as much sense as the coming together of God and the devil." And he turns to the bishops and he says, "If these guys have their way, I'll tell you what they're going to do." And he knows this from having lived in Scotland. He said, "Presbytery will meet, and every Tom, Dick, and Harry will think that he's suitable to correct me for the way I'm governing the country," which there had been some of that going on in the Church of Scotland. And he says to them, and this is a very important line that James said, and it's very important for later American history. He says to the bishops, "I know full well if they get rid of you, they will eventually get rid of me. No bishop, no king." James sees in the way the Presbyterians governed their church, there was this dangerous move towards republicanism, little r republicanism. And if they get rid of bishops, they'll eventually get rid of kings. And so he turns to the Puritans and he says, "You will submit, or I will harry you out of this land." But he agreed to one thing on their list. We can have a new translation, but it won't have any theological study notes in it. And that's the King James Bible. So he goes down, and of course the relationship between the Puritans and James is not real good. In fact, that's why they start coming to a place called Massachusetts. Okay? Because he becomes... 1604 was when he had this meeting. The King James Bible comes out in 1611, and the Puritans get to Massachusetts in 1620. It's all related to each other. All of this history is connected and related. James goes to London, and he begins the work of having a new revision made of the Bible. He chooses the best scholars from Oxford and Cambridge. James doesn't do any of the translating. It's of course, he depends on the biblical scholars to do that. The scholars come together, and they begin a long process of translation, which eventuates in 1611, the first edition of the King James Bible comes out. Now, this quote right here is very, very important, because if you look at the King James Bible, in the preface of the King James Bible, there's this thing called the note of the translators to the readers. And it's a very important line. "We never thought from the beginning that we should need to make a new translation, nor yet to make of a bad one a good one, but to make a good one better, or out of many good ones, one principal one. You see what they're saying? The King James Bible is a revision of the previous English translations that they've already had. And it's principally based on the Geneva Bible. So it doesn't just emerge in a vacuum. It comes as the result of this whole history that really goes back to William Tyndale. And like I said earlier, something like 80 to 90% of the King James Bible is the language of William Tyndale. And so the King James Bible comes out. It's interesting because if you look and you read the preface to the King James Bible, not every edition of it has the preface in it, this note to the readers from the translators. But there's this, long introduction to the Bible laying out the theological needs for it. And there's a lot of biblical citations in that introduction. The funny thing is, all of those citations are from the Geneva Bible. So the preface of the King James Bible, wherever the translators quoted the Bible, they were still using the Geneva. So the Geneva appears in the preface of the King James. When the King James came out, the first edition looked like this in the size and in the print. And it was big. You know why it was made so big? Because they were made for pulpit Bibles. These were pulpit Bibles. In fact, many of them were chained to the pulpits in England so that nobody could steal them, because the Bible was so expensive that you had to worry about them being stolen. If you can imagine that. The other thing is, in some ways, the King James Bible reflected the conservatism of the church of the time. Okay? If you look at this, this is what the text, this is what the first edition of the King James looked like. Now look at that script. Is that the script that they used in the Geneva Bible? It was a return to that old Gothic-looking script, because there was something in their minds that made them say that script just makes it look a little more mysterious and holy than that modern script does. I mean, that was kind of the motivation. In some places, a return to that old script again. Okay, if you look at the way the Geneva Bible actually looked, now remember, this is 51 years older than that one when it was published. Look at the script in this. See, it's that plain Latin script that we still use today. And it's got the study notes. So it was interesting. In some respects, the King James was sort of a step a little bit back. In a number of places, the translations are very similar between Geneva and the King James, very similar. And often you'll have a hard time finding a difference. But it was a very interesting difference. 1 Corinthians 13. Okay, what's that chapter about? Anybody remember? Love. And what does the King James say instead of love? Charity. Now it's interesting because all translations since the time of the King James have left the word charity behind and used what word? Love. All of our modern translations, because charity today means something a little different than it did then. Charity was used because the Latin word for love is the word caritas, which came into English in the form of charity. Caritas, the CH in Old English would have been pronounced like a K sound. Caritas, carity, and eventually charity. But so in some ways, the King James was actually a step back a little bit, and certainly in the way it was laid out. And so the Geneva Bible 1 Corinthians 13 says love. So when modern translations put the word love back in, they weren't so much putting something in that hadn't been there before, they were going back to the previous translation, which was the Geneva. So it's interesting to make that comparison. They're very similar, but in a lot of places, you'll find the Geneva will actually be a little more literal, and the English flows a little crisper. King James, they still, the church still liked some of the old Latin type of words. So in some places, the translations are a little bit. What happens? Well, the King James comes out initially. Remember all these Puritans that were told by the king, you will submit or I'll harry you out of the land? Well, I'll be dogged if I'm going to use his Bible. So they continued to use the Geneva Bible, which is why when the Puritans landed at Plymouth, 9 years after the King James was produced, their principal translation was still the Geneva Bible. The Crown didn't like this because they wanted to get rid of this Geneva Bible and all those study notes in it. And so they made a decree, only the new authorized version can be printed in England. So what happened? People were buying their Geneva Bibles from the Dutch because the Dutch printers over in Holland were still printing it for them. So then a law comes around. It is illegal to import English Bibles into England from anywhere else. You can only get your Bibles here. And it wasn't until about the 1640s that the King James Bible overtook the Geneva Bible in use. So it was kind of just an interesting little tug of war that was going on. The legacy of the Geneva Bible, though, is still with us in a lot of ways. You know that expression, and again, we'll have to go back because it's a lot of these old expressions are dying out in modern English, but when Esau sold his birthright to Jacob, remember that story? He sold it for what? What's the expression? It's the old, a mess of pottage. Have you heard that expression before? If you pull out your King James Bible, you're not going to find that expression, a mess of pottage. If you pull out your Geneva Bible and look at the text, you're not going to find that expression, a mess of pottage. But if you look in the study note of the Geneva Bible, you'll find that expression. That expression comes from a study note in the Geneva Bible on that text in Genesis. So, having said that, the King James Bible in the 1600s becomes the standard translation in English. So wherever the British Empire goes, the King James Bible goes with it. It has the impact of giving a standard for the English language. It begins to tie England together in the form of speech they're using, Scotland as well, as it becomes so popular, as it goes out into all the world, and of course, and then as it comes into this country as well. Okay, here we go. This is kind of a thing to give you kind of a sense of the legacy of that whole heritage of the Bible in English. And I haven't taken it, although it's all is the legacy of William Tyndale. But 1560, the Geneva Bible comes out. It is the best revision to date. The authorized or King James Version comes out, and like they said in the beginning, it didn't want to be a new translation. They were making an old one better. It was a revision. The first major revision of the King James Bible doesn't come until 1881. And it comes out in England. A group of scholars from England and the United States get together, and they come out with what's called the Revised Version. And it still reads a lot like the King James, lots of these and thous and all of that. But it is a revision on the basis of new manuscript findings that have happened in the ensuing time. The American scholars that are involved in that say to the Brits, well, there's some changes that we would like to make for an American edition that got voted down here in England. Can we go back to America and print it in that edition? And they said, in 20 years you can. For 20 years we'll use it the same in both places, and then in 20 years you can publish the American revisions. So the American Standard Version comes out in 1901. The Revised Version and the American Standard Version, and basically which is the same thing, it's just the American edition of the Revised Version, never really overtake the King James Bible, never even come close to it. The next revision has a huge impact, though, the Revised Standard Version. And the New Testament comes out in 1952. But see the name of this? It's still called the Revised Standard Version. By standard version, they're meaning it's a revision of this standard Bible tradition that we've had all along. It comes out, and I don't know, any of y'all, I don't know, you would have been, if you were alive in those days, you would have been very, very young when the first edition came out in 1952. There was a hullabaloo when the Revised Standard came out because people were convinced they had changed the Bible. And one of the translators, and I don't know, you can go back and you can read newspaper stories of big meetings and people burning copies of the Revised Standard Version because it was they changed the Bible and all of this. Well, I mean, the King James was a revision of the previous translations, and this was the newest revision. And that translation has had two revisions that have since come out. 1990, the new Revised Standard Version came out, and then in 2001, the English Standard Version came out. But again, as you look at this, and you're running out of names to use, right? I mean, you've got to come up with a new name every time you have a revision. But this little expression here shows that the translation is still based, is still based on this older King James, Geneva, Tyndale tradition. And so all of these translations are in the same family. They're all in the same family. So the work of William Tyndale still lives on in even our contemporary Bible translations.